How we doing, everybody? It's Coach Alex from Maximize Potential coming at y'all with another great Mobility Monday. Today we're talking about one of the most common overuse injuries in the US, tennis elbow. But before we get into that, if you haven't noticed, our cold weather gear is finally here. We've got sweaters, we've got sweatpants, we've got beanies, and we've got a good assortment of hoodies. Still got a handful of deals going on in the shop right now, so go ahead and grab some while the deals are still on. I'm gonna go ahead and leave a link down in the comments below. Today we're addressing tennis elbow and how to fix it. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Alrighty, y'all. So today we're talking about tennis elbow. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is, why it happens, and how we can treat it. Well, tennis elbow is one of the most common overuse injuries with over 200,000 new diagnoses in the US alone every year. Tennis elbow normally presents itself with pain in extension or gripping most objects, usually near that lateral portion of the forearm up near the elbow. Now, just as a little bit of an anatomy lesson here, the extensor muscles of the forearm all are going to come up and attach to the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. Now, really all that means is going to be that bony marking on the end of the humerus. So as you can imagine, this is going to be very common with people who are frequently gripping or extending or just using a lot of repetitive movements in the wrist and arm. So just like the name entails, a lot of tennis players are going to get this because they have a lot of wrist control with that racket. Maybe if you're in the gym and we're going up in weight just a little bit too quickly, or even desk workers who are using their fingers to type on keyboards or use a mouse frequently. All of these motions frequently put tension and strain on the muscles and tendons around this joint. Now, with the increase of strain and the continuation of these repetitive motions, we're going to have inflammation in that tendon, otherwise known as tendinopathy. Now, I don't want us to get scared about these big words. Tendinopathy essentially just means the inflammation of the tendon. Now, as I said earlier, the pain is normally going to present itself towards the outside portion of that forearm, but we can feel it a little bit further down into the forearm and sometimes even into the wrist. Now, with all this being said, we have to remember that this is not a mobility issue, it's an overuse issue. Tennis elbow usually moves through 3 separate stages. Of course, starting with stage number 1, being immediately after the onset or as soon as we start treatment. Normally, this is pretty painful and limits what we can do in our day-to-day lives. So step number 1 is to get the tension and the pain under control. Like I mentioned, during this stage 1, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of pain going on in this soft tissue. So we kind of want to stay away from stretching, stay away from exercising. I also want us to remember that ice isn't always going to be the best option. We may have heard the acronym RICE: rest, ice, compress, and elevate. Now, though this has been used for many decades in athletic injury, the doctor who actually coined the term RICE has since rescinded his statement on the use of ice. We've recently found out that ice is actually going to slow down the process. Because we're making the area cold, we're slowing down the blood flow to the area. And what we found out now is that increased blood flow is actually what's going to expedite the healing process. So our first step is we're going to go ahead and roll. So go ahead and grab a lacrosse ball. Alright, y'all, we're going to go ahead and get into an extensor roll or massage here. So we can use a couple of different tools to get into this. We can use a lacrosse ball, which is what I'm going to use today, or we can use a half-size foam roller or a hand roller. Now, if we don't have a hand roller or a foam roller, that's okay. We can use a rolling pin. Otherwise, we can actually just use our thumbs, and I'll show us how to get into those here in a second. So with an extensor roll, we have to remember the extensors are going to be on the back end, right on the back of that forearm here. So they're going to be what extends those fingers. So to roll it, we're going to go ahead and take that ball, and we're ideally going to want to use a tabletop. Now, I'm just on a box with a hard cover here, and I really want something hard, so this way I don't have too much give in that material below me here. So we're going to go ahead and place this on those extensors, and we're going to roll it out. Now, we want to find some knots, find some tension in some of these muscles. Now, when we do, we're going to sit on it 20 to 30 seconds or so. Now, as we feel that, we can slowly curl that hand up. This is going to pin and stretch on some of those knots. This is ideally going to take away some tension away from those tendons. Now, as we roll around, remember, we don't want to be on any bone. So we want to stay specifically on soft tissue. So watch out, obviously, for that radius, the ulna. We're not really too worried about that, but I'm worried a little bit about getting up towards that elbow. So as we roll towards that outside, just watch for one, that lateral epicondyle, but then also that ulna on the back here. We're going to find a couple of different spots. Ideally, we're in this extensor for about 2 minutes or so. Now, if we're using a foam roller or the hand roller, it's going to be the same exact thing. we're gonna go just upside down and roll for about 2 minutes or so. Like I said, when we find a spot, sit on it, put a little bit of extra pressure. We're gonna sit here for about 20 or 30 seconds and you should feel that pressure dissipate. Now, if we don't have any of these tools, you can absolutely use your thumb. Now, we're gonna have our forearm face up here. Now, go ahead and grab a little bit of massage oil or maybe just a little bit of lotion to kind of help lubricate the area so this way it's not so dry. But same principle here. We're gonna take our thumb and we're gonna find a couple of areas that may be a little bit tender. Now we're gonna sit there, and I really like to kind of notch my thumb just like this and dig right into those muscles. Now, as we're there, we're gonna go ahead and slowly pull out towards the wrist here. Like I said, finding a couple of different spots, and once we do, really press on here, a little bit of extra pressure, and roll it out towards the wrist here. Another way that we can do this, if we don't really feel comfortable having that underhand or we don't really want to do it with our hand, is going to be up against a wall. So, same kind of thing, we're going to take that lacrosse ball, we can use a foam roller, same thing, and pin it up against that wall. Now we're going to roll back and forth. I really like to use my opposite hand, and use it as kind of a guide. I'll sometimes put a little bit of extra pressure into that forearm just to get the added pressure that I need or I want. So, again, we're gonna be on these extensors for about 2 minutes here. I highly recommend that we do this either once every day or twice every other day. Now, as I mentioned, this is gonna help take off some tension from the soft tissue, from those attachment points at the elbow. So ideally, we're trying to moderate the pain as much as possible. Now, once we get this done for about a week or so, and that pain has come down to about a 3 or 4, we're gonna go ahead and start introducing some stretches. Alright, so now that we're done with our myofascial, ideally that tension is no longer focused on those attachment points. So our pain is under control, ideally less than like a 3 or 4 out of 10. So of course we're going to get into our stretch. Now our stretch is going to be an extensor stretch. And remember, like I said, those extensors right up on the top of the forearm. So we're going to want to pull those in the opposite direction of where they run. So we're going to take a hand, we want to use a nice tabletop here, and we're going the back of the hand flat down on the table. Now I don't want to put too much pressure in here, too much torque in this position isn't going to be very good for the wrist. So right here, light pressure, and you should feel a good stretch into those extensors. If we want to get a little bit further into that stretch, we're going to take those fingers, and rather having them pointed at us, we're going to point them over to the outside here. And again, if we want to get into a little bit of a further stretch, we can bend and extend in that elbow. That's going to give a little bit of contraction and pull into those extensors. Now, we're gonna do a couple of sets, maybe like 2 sets of 30 seconds. Give yourself a little bit of rest in between. Maybe do a couple of wrist circles, bring some life back into there, and get right back into this. Now, I'm gonna recommend again that we do this about once a day, or we can do this twice every other day. All right, now that we've got the tension away from the tendons, away from that soft tissue, we're gonna go ahead and get into some strengthening. Now, the strengthening is gonna be one of the most important parts of this because we need to have those muscles conditioned and strong so this way when we get into those smaller repetitive motions, they no longer bother us. Now the way that we're going to get into that is going to be an extensor towel roll. So I want us to go ahead and get a full-size towel. Now I went ahead and folded it in half long ways here just to make it a little bit easier to grip. Now what we're going to do is grab towards the top and we're slowly going to roll towards the face and tuck underneath. Now as we roll, of course, we're strengthening those extensors by pulling up towards those extensors, towards the face. But as we go further and further in that towel, the towel is going to get thicker and thicker, meaning that our grip is going to have to change over the time that we go from the top all the way to the bottom of this towel. And of course, working the different grips, hitting those tendons and those muscles from different angles is always going to be greatly important. So make sure we get a good squeeze on this towel, and once we get to the very end here, we have a brand new side to get to. So repeating again here, we're going to probably go about 2 or 3 sets, get a couple of towel lengths through. Now I highly recommend that we get into this at least every other day to make sure that we stay nice and conditioned in these extensors. But anyway, y'all, that's about all I got for us today. Go ahead and try some of these out at home. Or if you have any further questions, come and book a mobility session with me. Like I mentioned earlier, our cold weather gear is finally out. Those deals are still on, so go ahead and grab some while the deals are still on. Remember, y'all, this is always a conversation, so don't forget to leave a like, comment down below with anything that you learned, any questions that you may have, or any suggestions for future content that you want to see. But other than that, I'm Coach Alex. Y'all be good, drink some water, and I'll see y'all in the next one.